Good morning, everybody. Uh, Welcome to AP Government Online. Just wanted to say I apologize for the Zoom idea not working out, but I guess as of right now, we students don't have access to your cameras on your Chromebook, and thus you don't have access to basically get onto Zoom. At some point, if they change that, that would be really good for us, just so that we could interact and I could actually see and talk to each of you one-on-one or as a group would be kind of cool. But as of right now, we're just going to try to find other solutions to this. So this is what I decided to do for today. My main game plan for today is I want to go over that Unit 1 review guide that I assigned to you last week. I want to make sure everybody has done it and you know what the answers are. And then I want to just address the FRQs from chapters 1 and 2. So again, that everybody is kind of like on the same page. I think you guys are all well aware right now of what's going on. The AP government test, we don't have a definite date on it yet. Looks like it's going to be available for you to take on 2 different days, but we don't know what the 2 days are going to be. They're supposed to release more information on April 3rd, which I believe is this Friday. So as soon as I find out something from the College Board, whatever, I will let you guys know. But again, as of right now, the test is supposed to be one 45-minute session. Don't know the format yet, but most of the speculation or most of what I've read says that it's going to be FRQs. I don't know how many. Since it's 45 minutes, my guess and what some of the other AP government teachers are saying is that they think that it will be 2 of the first 3 types. There's a chance that they could just give you 1, and they could give you like type 4 and give you just 1 of type 4. If that's the case, then we will practice type 4 a lot in between April 3rd and whenever the test is, because obviously we need to practice those. But we'll worry about that on Friday after what they announce. So I hope all of you guys are staying safe out there. And these are crazy times right now. I've never experienced anything like this where we've been out of school for this long. It's just, I don't know what to say about it. It's just kind of crazy. I still think it's kind of funny looking back when we had the representative in class and asking him what he thought about the coronavirus and his reaction. And I still imagine if I could ask him now what his take is now, that he probably would have said something different when he was in class. But no one can foretell the future, so I can't give him too hard of a time. So, all right, let's get into that Unit 1 review packet. Hopefully you had a chance to do it. I know there's a lot of questions here, and I don't want to spend hours and hours of time going over this, but I just quickly wanted to zoom through it. Remember, from what it looks like right now, speculation is that you may be able to use your resources on the actual exam. So I would say it's in your best interest to make sure that you do these review guides and do them well, because you could use this. And if you can use it, that's to your advantage. Oh, by the way, I have a friend that just joined me here at the table. I just thought I'd introduce everybody. This is Cleo. Say hi, Cleo. She's like the world's greatest cat. And my dog is here too, Molly. I have her in the crate right now because if I had her out and about, she would be probably going crazy and not let me have any free time to actually do this. But they're over here. This is Molly. If she does any barking or during the video, I apologize. I'll try to kind of keep her under control, but sometimes she can get a little antsy in the morning. So, all right, getting back to that Unit 1 review guide. Question number 1 is define limited government. Hopefully everybody was able to do that. Just limited government, just the name itself kind of leads to what it means. The idea that the federal government can only do those things that are listed in the Constitution. The national government is limited by the Constitution. You could even say that our state governments too that is limited as well, because we have state constitutions that limit what the states can do too. So just the idea that the government can't do everything that it wants, it's limited by rules, regulations, and specifically the Constitution. Social contract. It's an agreement between people and the government. The people give up some of their freedoms, and in return for that, the government provides protections and other rights to them. Natural rights, just the idea that everyone is simply born with certain rights. As a human being, you have certain rights. Everyone does. That's what the natural rights idea was. According to John Locke, what are 3 rights that the government must protect? Obviously, life, liberty, and then he said property. Number 5, which 3 rights are mentioned as unalienable in the Declaration of Independence? There it was life, liberty, and then Jefferson switched up property to the pursuit of happiness. So those were the 3. Number 6, popular sovereignty, the idea that the power of the government comes from the people. Number 7, republicanism, is the idea that we have elected officials that represent us in government. We vote for them. Number 8, equality, hard to define, but basically we usually focus on the idea of equality or equal opportunity, that everyone has an equal opportunity, a chance for success. You might not take it, but you at least have a chance. Number 9, which of these ideas of democracy are reflected in the Declaration of Independence, quotes to support? You could look through the entire Declaration for examples of some of these ideas. I just looked through last night and found a few. At the very opening, it talks about it's necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands. That's the idea of popular sovereignty, that it's up to the people. There was something else mentioned about the consent of the governed, also popular sovereignty. It references the idea of the laws of nature, which I think you could tie into natural rights. And it talks about unalienable rights, which again would be natural rights. The idea that all men are created equal, obviously, would be an example of equality. And absolute tyranny was mentioned, and that would be the idea that what would lead to the idea for a limited government. So that was section 1.1, the first 9. So we'll keep on going. Section 1.2, types of democracy. Number 10, define participatory democracy. Give an example. The definition that I had was basically individual participation of citizens in political decisions. And an example of this would be like a New England town hall meeting where like everyone in the town votes on something. For you guys, it'd even be like when you vote for like Coming Home or Homecoming, King and Queen, where everybody basically are representatives, everybody gets a chance to vote. Number 11, define pluralist democracy and give an example. It's a political system where there is more than one center of power. It's where non-governmental groups get to exert influence in decisions, aka also like factions and interest groups. And an example would be like with abortion. If the government's going to pass a law against abortion, for instance, pluralist democracy would be where you'd have pro-life groups stepping in and pro-choice groups stepping in, sharing their opinions, like and trying to influence the congressman as they go to pass that law. Number 12, define elite democracy. Give an example. Elected officials make decisions. An example, basically that $2 trillion bill that was just passed to deal with the coronavirus effects in the country, that would be an example of elite democracy. The House and the Senate voted on it. The president will sign it, but that's the idea of elected officials making that decision. Number 13, which type of democracy would Madison argue combats against factions? Federalist 10. The correct answer here is pluralist. And hopefully you remember the main idea of that. Since he said that you really can't stop factions from forming, the best thing that we can do is basically let them exist and let them try to cancel each other out. That's the idea. They can cancel each other out, and that's a pluralist type of democracy. That was the first page. So we're getting there. How's everybody doing? I know this is probably not the most exciting video that you've ever seen in the world, but we're making it through. We're making it through. Page 2, 1.3. Number 14, what type of government did the Anti-Federalists argue for in Brutus number 1? And what did they say was best and why? I had put down that they wanted a smaller confederation type of government. They argued that the Constitution, basically, if we passed it, was going to generate too much power for the national government. The country would be too big. It would have too many interests out there competing against each other. And they also made other arguments too, like that people really wouldn't know their leaders that well. You wouldn't have personally met them, so they'd be kind of far and unattached from you. So there were all kinds of different reasoning behind that. So they wanted a small confederation style of government, kind of like what we already had, but maybe just tweak it a little bit. Number 15, according to Brutus, what could happen to individual rights as the scope of government grew? Basically, they would be greatly reduced. Number 16, what type of government did the Federalists argue in Federalist 10 was best, and why? Basically, the main answers here are going to be pluralist. They wanted a pluralist, but I also put down they wanted, or you even could say they wanted a representative and pluralist republic. A representative and pluralist republic. And again, the main idea here is let factions neutralize each other. Number 17, define confederation or confederate system. It's an organization, a form of government that is basically an alliance, like a loose alliance of friends. Number 18, why did the founders establish a confederate system upon declaring independence? There was just a fear of tyranny. They had seen what King George III had done and what Parliament had done, and they wanted to get away from that. They wanted to change that. Number 19, what did American government look like under the Articles of Confederation? Be specific. The national government had few powers. Each state had one vote in Congress. It took 9 out of 13 to pass a law. You needed unanimous consent to change the articles. We had a president, but he really didn't have any power. I think his term was like 1 year. And again, trivia there, who was the first president of the United States? Most people would tell you George Washington, but in fact, it was a guy named John Hanson. But again, only 1 year, not much power. There was no national court. Some things that the government could do, they could engage in diplomacy, they could declare war, they could acquire land, they could do extradition, where you send a criminal from one place back to the place they committed the crime. All of those things were allowed. Number 20, what were 3 weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation? And then it says star, the biggest weakness. I wrote down they couldn't regulate interstate commerce, they couldn't tax, they couldn't raise an army, there was no national court, there was no national currency. It was kind of like an opinion question of which one you thought was the biggest weakness. I think you could argue either not couldn't tax, or they couldn't regulate interstate commerce. Those were probably the 2 biggest ones, but probably most people would go with tax, but that's up to you. Number 21, what incidents highlighted the key weaknesses of the Articles? I wrote down it took 4 years for them to fully go into effect. They were created in 1777, and they weren't passed until 1781. They couldn't get all the states to agree to it until 4 years later. That's a weakness. Another one would be the Shays Rebellion, and hopefully you remember Shays Rebellion. That Daniel Shays, he had been in the military and fought in the Revolutionary War. Then afterwards, he was a farmer, and the farmers were having their farms foreclosed, and so basically they led a little rebellion where they shut down the court system and stuff to try to stop the farm foreclosures. And then it took a decent amount of time for the government to put that rebellion down. It was a sign that the national government was a little too weak at this point. Articles really weren't working. Number 22, the Great Compromise. Combination of the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan. Hopefully you remember what those were, what they called for. We kind of reenacted that in class. I had people play different roles. Hopefully you remember that. Edmund Randolph wrote the Virginia Plan. Or actually, no, sorry, scratch that. Scratch that. Madison wrote the Virginia Plan. He had Edmund Randolph present it. And that basically said that the House and the Senate should both be based off of population. The New Jersey Plan was presented by William Patterson, and that said that there should be equal representation in the Congress. What they did was the Great Compromise, or also known as the Connecticut Compromise. They said the House will be based on population, and then the Senate, every state would get 2. So they kind of combined features of both the Virginia and the New Jersey plans together, and that's obviously what our government looks like today with the Congress. 23, the Electoral College. Remember, some of the founding fathers did not trust the people to make the decision for president. They did not trust pure democracy, so they put the Electoral College in as a compromise for this. And basically, I think we've talked about it enough. You know how it works, generally speaking. The people get to vote for the president, but what you're really voting for are the number of electors that are later on going to make the decision for the president. And the electors are supposed to vote based off how the popular vote was, but they don't have to. But generally they do. States get to choose how the electors are chosen. And remember, for the Electoral College, the number that each state gets, it's a combination of the number of representatives that you have and the senators. So for instance, like in Michigan right now, we have 14 representatives, and we have 2 senators. So as far as the Electoral College goes, 14 plus 2 would be 16. So we would get 16 electoral votes. So that's the second page. Everybody doing okay? We're 15 minutes in. Let's keep on going. 24, the 3/5 compromise. A lot of people forget, as far as the compromise goes, that both sides have to get something. So most people remember that for the South, they now were able to count 5 slaves as 3 people for representation in the House, for Congress. But what did the North get? The North got the opportunity to count those same slaves, 5 as 3 people, for taxation purposes. So the U.S. government would get more tax money from the South too. So both the South and the North got something out of the 3/5 compromise. 25, slavery. Congress didn't really talk much about slavery in the actual Constitution when they wrote it. They did acknowledge, though, that they would not touch the importation of slaves for 20 years. 26, the right to vote. Ask yourself the question, when the Constitution was ratified, who could vote? I think you know who couldn't vote. Who could actually vote? And hopefully you wrote down white men who own property. 27, define separation of powers, the idea that we have 3 branches of government, each with its own set of powers. Do you remember the guy who came up with that idea? He's never remembered in history for whatever reason. Baron de Montesquieu. He's the guy. 28, what does Madison say about separation of powers in Federalist 51? He basically said that they help guard against tyranny. The idea that each part of the government has different functions and then they're not directly linked to each other, that was mentioned in the Federalist 51. They have different modes of election. They're elected usually at different times, and they again can do different actions. So those are some of the specific things mentioned in Federalist 51. Just remember again, Madison stressed the idea that separation of powers and checks and balances were good things. 29, define checks and balances, the idea that each branch of government can limit the effects of the others. And then can you name any examples? For instance, what can the president do to Congress? Can you think of anything? Hopefully you can think of veto. What can Congress do back to the president? Well, they can impeach him, but they also can override a veto. And then the Supreme Court. What can the president do to the Supreme Court? He can name the justices. What can the Supreme Court do to the president? They can use judicial review and declare something that he does unconstitutional. What can Congress do to the Supreme Court? They get to confirm whoever the president nominates for a judge. And what can the Supreme Court do back to Congress? Again, judicial review. They can say a law passed by Congress is unconstitutional. Oh, getting back. Where do we leave off here? Number 30. What does Madison say about checks and balances in Federalist 51? I looked in that. It basically says, Federalist 51 samples of it are on pages 29 to 30 in the AMSCO book. They say that it allows the government to control itself. It helps limit the power of the government. So that was kind of like what some of the specific phrasing in Federalist 51 regarding checks and balances. 31, define federalism. The sharing of powers between a central government and equally sovereign regional governments. So basically for us, it's a combination of the U.S. government working with the state governments. 32, define enumerated powers, and where can they be found? They are powers that are specifically given to Congress, to the national government, and they're found in Article 1, Section 8. Number 33, define implied powers. Powers that are not specifically listed in the Constitution but can be implied from other listed enumerated powers. An example, an enumerated power given to Congress in Article 1, Section 8 would be taxing. It's implied that the government can have an IRS to help then collect the taxes. So that would be an example of implied. 34, what constitutional clause gives Congress implied powers, and define that clause? It's Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, and hopefully you all remember what's that called? The Necessary and Proper Clause, also known as the Elastic Clause. So, all right, we're making progress. We're going on to another page. 35. What clause gives the president implied powers and define that clause. We didn't really talk much about this. They have a hint on here. It's also referred to as the vesting clause for the president. I looked this up, and it was basically Article 2, Section 1, Clause 1, and it basically just says the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. I think the reason why they consider that to be an implied power kind of thing is that it's so vague that it's kind of up to the president to determine what executive power means, of what he can do. And then obviously Congress can challenge that, or the Supreme Court can challenge that, but they claim that that's the vesting clause and that's the implied powers of the president. 36, define reserve powers and where can they be found in the Constitution. Powers that are given to the states, and the main place you find this referenced in the Constitution is the 10th Amendment. All the powers not given to the national government are then thus reserved for the states. 37, what are concurrent powers? And give an example, powers that are given to the national government and to the states. An example, taxes. The national government can tax us, like your income tax. The states can tax us, like with the state sales tax. So that's an example of a concurrent power. 38, define dual federalism. When was this most prominent? This is the idea where the national government is dominant in its sphere, and then the states are dominant in their sphere. I looked this up in the AMSCO book, and it says that this idea, dual federalism, was dominant pretty much prior to the progressive era, which would have been like the early 1900s. And 39, define cooperative federalism. When was this most prominent? National and state governments working cooperatively together. Example would be like the grants and aid programs where the national government gives money to the states. This was very popular during the Progressive Era, the New Deal, and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. So the early 1900s, the 1930s, and the 1960s. Flipping to the next page, we get this table layout. It wants to do a definition, example, and then how concept impacts the balance of power between state and national governments, who benefits the most. Up for 41 is revenue sharing. Definition, distribution of a portion of federal tax revenues to state and local governments. So the national government gives money to the states. An example, the U.S. government gives Michigan $5 million to help with relief from the coronavirus. That would be an example. And how does this impact the idea of federalism? It's basically a sign that the national government is more powerful because they're the ones that are giving the money away. And who's it going to help? It's obviously going to help the states. But you could argue it helps everybody. It helps the national government too because they want to contain the virus and make sure that people aren't dying from it. 42, mandate or unfunded mandate. It's an order for states to do something. And the unfunded example here would be no money is provided to do it. We watched a movie once in class on this, and there was like a story about these wolves, and I can't remember what state it was. I don't know if it was Idaho. The national government passed this mandate or this idea that these wolves had to be allowed to exist in Idaho, and they released them back into the wild. The state wasn't happy about it, and it was left up to the states to deal with it. So they were going to have to pay the money and do the protections of the people and stuff themselves. And then how does this impact the relationship between the states and the national government? This really enhances the national government's power. It weakens the states, so it obviously helps the national government the most. 43, categorical grant. Money given to states for a very specific purpose by the national government. An example would be the U.S. gives Michigan $10 billion to fix interstate roads. How does this impact? I'm getting a phone call. I'm going to decline it right now. And how does this impact the relationship between states and national government? It's a sign that the national government is more powerful. And then you could argue that it's going to benefit both the states and the national. It benefits the states because it gives them money, but also it's going to benefit the national because they kind of laid out the terms of what the money has to be used for. Very specific. 44, block grant. Definition, money given to the states for some general, broad purpose. Example, the U.S. gives Michigan $10 billion for its efforts against drugs. Very broad. And I mean, the Michigan can do pretty much whatever they want then with that money as long as there's something involving drug prevention. I mean, they could put it into rehab, they could put it into making it a crime. They can almost do anything they want as long as, again, it's loosely tied to drug enforcement. How does this impact the relationship between the states and the national? It's very cooperative. There were in basically, but it benefits the states. Well, it benefits both, but the states love block grants. I mean, it's just like, here's some money and then do what you want with it for this general idea, this general purpose. They love it. They love block grants. Oh, flipping it over, we're getting there. 45, the 10th Amendment. Definition: powers not given to the national government are reserved for the states. How does it impact the balance of power between the states and the national government? Who benefits the most? This really ties into federalism, and it basically makes sure that the states have a role in our type of government. And I would argue it benefits the states the most. 16, the 14th Amendment. Definition: remember, this set up the idea of citizenship, and basically making sure, like, obviously, like, minorities and everything are considered to be citizens. Due process and equal protection. Those are huge. Remember, for like a lot of our FRQs and stuff, the 14th Amendment comes into play a lot. Just primarily remember the due process and equal protection. How does this impact the balance of power? Remember, one of the big things here was that the states must also abide by the Bill of Rights. And it set up the idea of selective incorporation. So just remember, so for instance, like due process. Due process is mentioned in the Fifth Amendment too. The Fifth Amendment was supposed to be designed primarily just to affect the national government. The 14th Amendment basically says, wait a second, due process applies to everybody, even in the states, and it applies to the state governments too. So just, again, remember, the key thing there would be like selective incorporation. The states have to abide by the Bill of Rights as well. 47, Commerce Clause. It's found in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3. The U.S. government, Congress, can regulate interstate commerce. How does this affect the relationship, the balance of power? It lets the national government regulate a lot of stuff these days, if it can argue that it's interstate commerce. So it really strengthens the power of the national government at the expense of the states, and just the wide variety of things that the national government can regulate now because of that Commerce Clause. The list is huge. 48, the Necessary and Proper Clause. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. It's also called the Elastic Clause, and it set up implied powers. The relationship, it greatly enhances the power of the national government, and it can do many more things than are listed specifically in the Constitution. So again, but what it has to do is it's got to take an enumerated power, and it has to be an extension of that. They have to be able to argue that something that they're going to do ties into one of the listed powers. In 49, the Supremacy Clause is found in Article 6, Clause 2, and it basically says the national government is supreme. And as far as the relationship, it benefits the national government. It basically enhances the power of the national government. It says the national government is the top level, what they say is supposed to go. Oh, we've made it to the final page of this review packet. 51, summarize the impact on the balance of power between national and state government based on the holding in McCulloch versus Maryland. If you remember that case, it involved the creation of a national bank, and the state of Maryland was trying to tax it. The two clauses of the Constitution that are identified here that you need to reference would be the Necessary and Proper Clause, the idea that the government had the right to set up a national bank, and the Supremacy Clause, which basically meant that the U.S. national government is supreme, and the state of Maryland cannot tax it. So again, necessary and proper, supremacy. The government could create a bank, and Maryland could not tax it. 52, summarize the facts of the United States versus Lopez. The U.S. government tried to enforce a gun-free zone at a public high school. They argued they could do this because of the Commerce Clause, regulating interstate commerce. It went to the Supreme Court, and basically the Supreme Court said that gun restriction is not an interstate commerce issue. They said basically because of the 10th Amendment, the regulation of schools is a reserved power for the states. 53, summarize the impact on the balance of power between the national and state government based on the holding of U.S. versus Lopez. It kind of swung things back a little bit into the favor of the states. The government can argue a lot of things fall under interstate commerce, but they can't argue that everything does. And again, something like gun restriction is not an interstate, in schools, I should say. Gun restriction in schools is not an interstate commerce issue. 54, how does public education show the complexity of federalism? Um, Public education is primarily a state issue. States are supposed to deal with it. However, the U.S. government, we have a Department of Education. You know, Betsy DeVos she's the secretary of it for President Trump. And the national government does give money to the states for education and can set some guidelines. But again, the states are supposed to be in charge of it. So it just shows you, again, it's complex that both levels of government can get involved. 55, how does the legalization of marijuana showcase federalism despite going against the Supremacy Clause? We've talked about this. The national government has passed laws that basically say that marijuana usage is illegal. So it's supposed to be illegal nationwide, all 50 states. However, we know that states have voted themselves, ballot initiatives and things, for the people have voted to allow marijuana usage. So the Supremacy Clause would make you think that the national government's law would be the law, that would be it. But we know that it depends somewhat on the president who's in charge, their administration, and where they stand, and then Congress at the time. So lots of times, like when we studied like President Obama, his stance on it was if a state has voted to allow it, the national government would not go in and actively enforce it then within that state to go in like and arrest people. But then if it became an interstate issue where it was going into other states that had not voted to allow it, then that's where the problems could occur. Again, it comes down to the president in charge and Congress at the time. But this shows you again the complexity. And in 56, what other current issues involve federalism? I think the best example right now would be the coronavirus and how we're dealing with it. The state of Michigan, we have the stay-in-place guidelines going on right now through April 13th at the state level. The U.S. government just passed that $2 trillion bill to deal with coronavirus relief, so that's at the national level. And then President Trump just announced yesterday that they're going to continue that